when Donald Trump launched a new trade war with China by imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, many believed China would quickly back down. The logic seemed simple. China exports nearly $600 billion worth of goods to the United States every year, around 15% of all its global exports. For a country so deeply connected to international trade and seemingly reliant on American consumers, it looked like a one-sided relationship. Most assumed that China couldn't afford to lose its biggest market without facing serious consequences. But what happened next surprised many. Instead of yielding, China retaliated swiftly and forcefully. It immediately placed tariffs on American goods, mirroring each move the U.S. made. But China didn't stop there. It restricted the export of critical materials that American companies relied on. It made it harder for U.S. businesses to operate in China. Some major American companies were even blacklisted, banned from doing business in the country. This wasn't the response of a nation caught off guard or intimidated. It was measured, strategic, and made it clear that China was ready to stand its ground. Many in the West struggled to understand it. How could a country so dependent on the U.S. market stand firm under pressure? Why didn't it cave? The answer lay beneath the surface, rooted in a quiet, long-term transformation of China's economy. For over a decade, China had been shifting its focus. Instead of chasing short-term profits, it was investing in long-term strength. Unlike many Western economies that rely heavily on consumer spending, China poured its resources into infrastructure, manufacturing, and innovation. Nearly 40% of its annual GDP went into building roads, factories, and technology, about double the rate of most other major economies. This wasn't just spending, it was strategy. China was deliberately reshaping its economy to be stronger, more self-reliant, and prepared for future challenges. And the results are now visible. Chinese companies once dismissed as low quality or imitators have become global leaders. BYD, a car maker once seen as minor, is now the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, surpassing even Tesla. ByteDance, the creator of TikTok, built one of the fastest-growing social media platforms in history. In industries like electronics, automobiles, software, and artificial intelligence, Chinese firms are no longer just following. They're innovating and leading. But China's rapid rise hasn't been without setbacks. A major housing crisis has left millions with unfinished homes. The country's population is aging quickly, which threatens long-term workforce growth. Youth unemployment is high, leading to frustration and unrest. And the breakneck economic growth of past decades has notably slowed. Still, despite these challenges, China continues to build, invest, and push forward. Today's China is a nation of contrasts, strong and vulnerable at the same time. In some areas, it's surging ahead. In others, it's struggling. This complexity makes it difficult for outsiders, particularly in the West, to fully grasp what's happening. For years, the dominant narrative was simple. China grew by producing cheap goods, and the West, especially the U.S., bought them. But that story is changing fast. Since the late 1970s, China's growth was closely tied to Western capital and demand. American companies flocked to China to benefit from cheap labor and rapid development. China manufactured goods on a massive scale and sold them to the world. It was a system that worked well, until it didn't. Western businesses profited by cutting costs. Consumers enjoyed cheaper products. China's economy expanded rapidly, but there was always an underlying risk. China had become too dependent on the West. That risk became evident by the late 2000s and early 2010s. In the U.S., millions of manufacturing jobs vanished, over 3 million between 2001 and 2017. At the same time, Chinese firms gained strength in global markets, while Western companies faced growing challenges operating in China. Tensions increased. American politicians, business leaders, and workers began to question whether the system was fair. By 2016, being tough on China wasn't just a fringe stance. It had become a mainstream winning political position. After taking office, President Trump acted on that sentiment. He slapped tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The goal was to raise the cost of Chinese imports and push American companies to bring manufacturing back home. But the dispute quickly escalated beyond trade. It became a struggle for technological dominance. The U.S. blacklisted Huawei, one of China's top telecom companies, and restricted China's access to advanced computer chips and research. The conflict was no longer just about trade fairness. It was about who would lead in the next era of innovation. Under President Biden, the rhetoric softened, but the strategy remained. Tariffs stayed in place. Restrictions tightened, especially on American exports to China in key sectors like artificial intelligence, aerospace, and advanced electronics. When Trump returned to the White House in 2025, the trade fight escalated further. New tariffs were imposed on electric vehicles, solar panels, and other green technologies, some reaching as high as 100%. China responded swiftly and forcefully, but this time was different. China was no longer vulnerable or dependent. It had spent years preparing for this moment with a national strategy known as dual circulation. This strategy was designed to make China more self-reliant while continuing to engage in global trade. It had two main goals: boost domestic consumption and reduce dependence on Western economies, particularly the United States. The first part focused on turning Chinese citizens into the primary consumers of Chinese goods. Rather than sending everything overseas, China began strengthening local supply chains, supporting homegrown innovation, and empowering families to spend more. At the same time, it didn't abandon international trade. It simply shifted its focus. China forged closer economic ties with countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. These regions provided new markets, cooperative governments, and a shared desire to reduce reliance on Western powers. And the plan is bearing fruit. By 2024, nearly half of China's GDP came from domestic consumption, a major shift for a nation that had relied on exports for decades. For over 10 years, China's growth has been fueled primarily by its own people and industries, not foreign buyers. Still, serious challenges remain. Although Chinese households are spending more, it's not yet enough to fully drive the economy. One reason is China's weak social safety net. In difficult times, people know they must rely on themselves. Less than 1% of the country's GDP is spent on unemployment benefits, pensions, or health care. With a fragile housing market, rising education costs, and a rapidly aging population, many families prefer to save rather than spend. Even so, China continues to press forward. It is no longer primarily focused on the U.S. and Europe. Instead, its exports are increasingly directed towards Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America, regions that were once overlooked but are now critical trade partners. This shift wasn't accidental. It was made possible through massive investment, especially via the Belt and Road Initiative. Under this program, China has invested over $1 trillion in infrastructure, building roads, ports, power plants, and digital networks in more than 140 countries. This effort is about more than trade. It's about influence, access, and control over the future. Chinese goods, from solar panels to steel, are now widespread. In many industries, China produces more than it consumes. To some, this might seem excessive, but to China, it's strategic. By flooding global markets with cheap, high-quality products, it becomes indispensable. European nations depend on Chinese solar panels. American automakers need Chinese batteries. Developing countries rely on Chinese steel. The more China supplies, the more it shapes global demand. All of this is powered by a different kind of system: state-led capitalism. The government plays a central role in guiding economic growth, rather than leaving it entirely to the private sector. This has enabled rapid progress, but also comes with risks. Debt is rising fast and could exceed 100% of GDP by 2026. Some projects, like Go Cities and unused rail lines, suggest waste and inefficiency. The system isn't flawless, but it's designed for endurance, not just speed. The quiet interdependence of the past is over. China is no longer just the world's factory waiting for orders. It is building an economy that can stand on its own, withstand external pressure, and lead according to its own vision. It still faces major hurdles, but it isn't retreating. It is evolving, investing, and positioning itself for the future. Now, the question is no longer whether China can survive without the West. The real question is the world ready for a global economy where China no longer needs anyone's permission?